Hello, and welcome back to Avon Talks. Today I'm joined by Art Custer of the Avon Old Farms School. How are you doing today?
Just great. How are you?
It's very rainy today. It's very, very foggy outside, but I'm doing well. I'm doing well.
We were able to get here. There's
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's true. So, just to start off, I'm sure most people living in this area know more or less about the Avon Old Farms School, but could you basically, just to cover all bases, quickly tell us what the Avon Old Farms School is?
Well, sure. The short version is Avon Old Farms is an independent school, boarding school for boys in grades 9 through 12 and some postgraduates.
How did this school come to be? How did the school become what it is today since the founding in 1927, I believe, right?
1927 is right. Well, I'll start with the founding itself. I
Mm-hmm.
think our founder was a pretty amazing woman
Yeah.
named Theodate Pope Riddle.
Mm-hmm.
That was her name at the end of her life, Theodate Pope, when she first got the idea to build the school. It was intended and built as a memorial to her father.
Mm-hmm.
She when her father passed away, she spent some time agonizing over how best to honor his legacy and decided that the thing to do was to build a boys' school.
Mm-hmm.
And she set about buying up acreage in
Mm-hmm.
Farmington and Avon as a potential site for the school, and also went on a tour of well-known independent boarding schools in New England, of which, as you know, there are plenty,
Mm-hmm.
and decided that what she saw was, just ample examples of what she didn't want her school to be. And then the actual construction of the school started around 1922,
Mm-hmm.
and the school opened in the fall of 1927 with
Mm-hmm.
a small faculty and a small student body.
What was the early school like? So I know there was a lot of trouble, or it wasn't smooth sailing right off the bat. There was trouble growing the school. There were some of the growing pains. What was that period like for Avon Old Farms?
Well, it's interesting that we divide the history of the school into eras,
Mm-hmm.
as one does, and the founders' era is the period from the opening of the school in 27
Mm-hmm.
to the closing of the school in 1944.
Mm-hmm.
The school was forced to close in 44 and then reopened in 48. But from 27 to 44 is known as the founders' era because Theodate Pope Riddle was alive during that time.
Mm-hmm.
And between 27 and 44, she went through three heads of schools,
Mm-hmm.
and two entire faculties quit en masse.
Uh-huh.
Now, I say en masse when the 1930 faculty quit en masse. We're talking about perhaps six
Uh-huh.
gentlemen.
Yeah.
By 1944, it was a much larger group of people. And this is the interesting thing. There is no question that Theodate Pope Riddle was an eccentric, headstrong woman.
Mm-hmm.
However, that can be exaggerated, and in my opinion,
Mm-hmm.
as has been exaggerated in a lot of ways. People felt that throughout the founders' era, she was somehow meddlesome and
Mm-hmm.
injected herself into the operation of the school in ways that she shouldn't have,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. I'm wondering if she had been a man
Mm-hmm.
who came up with the idea for a school, bought its land,
Mm-hmm.
designed its buildings, paid for the construction of the buildings, and then made up the budget shortfall each year. If that man's having a say in how the school was run would have been considered meddling.
Yeah, that was actually a question that I had when you mentioned that a lot of the people quit en masse. I was sort of wondering whether or not her being a woman in the time had like an impact on this, and whether or not just simply the idea that a woman had started an all boys school in 1927. I feel like that's pretty unheard of. That's a very unprecedented sort of thing to go on in New England.
I honestly don't know how unusual it was for a woman to found a school, but certainly if you were going to create a school in those days, it was more than likely going to be a boys' school,
Mm-hmm.
although she was very familiar with girls' schools. She's
Mm-hmm.
a Miss Porter's graduate, and she was the architect for Westover School.
Um, and then from 1944 to 1948, these 4 years between the two parts of the school's history, Avon Old Farms had actually become a hospital for that period. Am I right?
That's right.
During the World War II period. Could you talk a little bit about, I guess, why that happened and what Avon did during that time and how that might have impacted Avon moving forward?
Sure. Well, Theodate Pope Riddle had a relationship with Franklin Roosevelt, or
The
more,
Franklin
the,
Roosevelt?
the Franklin Roosevelt, the guy who was in the White House.
Uh-huh.
And more to the point, I think it was with his mother,
Mm-hmm.
rather. Her relationship was with his mother, or her family's relationship. In any event, that gave her an in when she decided that the school needed to close, which
Mm-hmm.
came in 44 for a number of reasons. She offered the school to President Roosevelt,
Mm-hmm.
and the decision was made. I'm not fully cognizant of who made the decision to
Mm-hmm.
turn it into a hospital for the training of blinded World War II veterans.
Mm-hmm.
So, from shortly after commencement in 1944 until sometime in 46 or 47,
Mm-hmm.
the Army occupied the grounds and the buildings, and blinded World War II veterans came to Avon to learn how to cope
Mm-hmm.
with life as a blind man. There's some interesting vignettes that come out of that period. They used to learn the campus by, they called it brailing it.
Mm-hmm.
They had several models of the school, a big one
Mm-hmm.
and lots of smaller ones. And so you would just feel your way around these models to learn where things were in relation to each other. The men, when they were on campus, were not supposed to use canes. They were
Mm-hmm.
allowed to use canes when they went off campus. But on campus, you had to echolocate / just know where stuff was.
Yeah.
And apparently there was one tree that wasn't on any of these models that came to be called Big Bertha, and it was a
Uh-huh.
rite of passage. If you came to the Avon Old Farms Convalescent Hospital at some point or another, you were going to walk smack into Big Bertha. And I guess they just thought that was
Is the tree still on
okay.
campus?
No, at least I can't. From the descriptions that I've read,
Mm-hmm.
there isn't a tree where I think it should be, but
Mm-hmm.
I could be mistaken.
Are there relics from this period that are still sprinkled around campus that students can find, or has it mostly been erased?
There are a lot of relics from this period in the archives.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Students can't really find those unless someone's down there and willing to show them to them.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, I don't know where Big Bertha is or was.
Mm-hmm.
They could see that, but no, I'm not aware of
Okay.
much. There was a kind of clumsy effort to transform the campus back into a school as the
Oh, I
Army
see.
was leaving, and they did a lot of damage,
Mm-hmm.
including dropping a grand piano from a flatbed truck onto the slate walkway just
Uh-huh.
as the new head of school was approaching. But one historian, my predecessor, was convinced that that damage was crucial because the money that the Army paid for having done it
Mm-hmm.
turned out to be basically the budget for reopening the school.
Okay, I see. So part of the reason why the school was able to reopen was because they had lent it out to the Army during this period?
Well, I certainly the money was
Mm-hmm.
helpful
Mm-hmm.
that came about as a result of that, and frankly, there were a couple of other things that were crucial. The Army had put a sprinkler system
Mm-hmm.
into the buildings,
Mm-hmm.
and there also in the main quad there were no fire escapes.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're familiar with the architecture, you know that a traditional metal fire escape on the outside of the building just would not
Mm-hmm.
be acceptable on those buildings. And so the Army cut doors from the hallways of the dormitories
Mm-hmm.
into the adjacent faculty houses.
Mm-hmm.
And then the stairwells in the faculty houses became secondary stairwells and qualify as fire escapes, which is, great. Some night you're sleeping in your
Yeah.
bedroom and you wake up and realize the whole dorm is filing past your bedroom door because a fire alarm has gone off and they've chosen to go out that way. But that did make it possible to reopen the school. It might have been cost prohibitive otherwise.
And how would you say that the school has rebounded from its closing in 1944? What was that process like? From 1948, after the army has left, after they left all these renovations, what was that process like going into now in 2023?
Well, it's interesting. I mentioned that there were 3 heads of school during the founders era. We're only on the 4th in the post 1948 era. So we had a gentleman named Don Pierpont, who was the head of school for 20 years, who was followed by George Troutman, who was the headmaster for 29 years. And then when he retired, Ken LaRock took over for 22 years, and now Jim DeTora is in his 5th year as the head of school. And I would submit that each of those heads of school has been exactly what the school needed in the moment when he took over. And so in 47, really, when the board chose Don Pierpont to reopen the school, he just was indefatigable in recruiting faculty and recruiting students. The school, for his whole 20 years, had no endowment, not no endowment to speak of, just no endowment, was entirely dependent on income from tuition. To the point where the 100th student that he recruited for the first year, the 48, 49, I don't know his first name. His last name was McNulty. And I don't know his first name because Don Pierpont consistently referred to him as Praise God McNulty because he was so grateful that he was going to have at least 100 tuitions to go on.
That's actually a lot more tumultuous of a journey or of a history for Avon Old Farms than I had imagined it to be. I wonder, do you know much about the histories of other boarding schools and whether or not they've also had similar sorts of ups and downs in their path, or do you think this is something that's fairly unique to the story and legacy of AOF?
I don't know that much about too many. I have read some other school histories because I'm writing one, and I wanted to get a sense of the genre, as it were. But I was paying more attention to what kinds of stories the authors chose to tell and what their sources were and so on. I think probably a number of schools have had more money than Avon because the traditional New England boarding school clientele, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, was the very wealthy. And that was certainly the group for whom Avon Old Farms was first intended. Since 1948, it hasn't really been that way. We certainly have had students who come from very comfortable backgrounds, but we've also had plenty of students who don't. And so we have been, in the parlance of the industry, I don't like the word industry for education, but tuition driven for a lot of the second half of the 20th century. So when Don Pierpont died suddenly and the board chose George Troutman to be the new headmaster, they were very, very different people, but the financial situation hadn't changed. What Don Pierpont had achieved was keeping the school open for 20 years so that there was a place for George Troutman to come and take charge of. He admitted sort of quietly in interviews prior to his retirement that he's not sure he understood the financial situation clearly when he accepted the role, or he might not have done that. So then he ran the school for 29 years, and there was an endowment of $35 million by the time he stepped aside. So he put the school on a much more firm financial, not that that's wealthy in terms of independent school endowments, but it does provide a bit of a cushion. At the same time, the difference between Don Pierpont and George Troutman is almost night and day. In his last board report, Don had said, essentially, maybe it's time we stop caring about things like dress codes and haircuts.
Yeah.
And the first thing that George Troutman did as headmaster was to write to the student body he was taking over in the summer. He wrote to the student body and said, don't come back to campus with long hair. I'm going to make you get it cut on day one. And he made good on that pledge. You couldn't even put your suitcase in your room. If you thought your hair was too long, he wouldn't tell you which room you had. You put your stuff on the ground and you got in the van and you went into town to get your hair cut. And there were a few students who had to get in the van more than once before their hair passed muster with Troutman. So he went in completely the other direction. And oh, by the way, I'm talking about 1969 now, so not a time in American history where, traditional conservative authority was
I mean, this is when
respected.
the hippie movement was
Exactly.
like thriving. Yeah.
Exactly, and particularly among young people, that was when people said never trust anybody over 30 and so on. But he pulled it off and in many ways helped to get the school more firmly on the map. And as I say, did some good work on the financial foundation so that when he stepped aside, Ken LaRocque was coming into a slightly more comfortable position than either Don Pierpont or George Troutman had enjoyed.
I wonder, I know a lot of people have favorite presidents. Do you have a favorite head of school that you could speak of during Avon Old Farms, or is this not something that you thought about before?
I haven't. I have worked for the last three and really consider the last two to be good friends. So I certainly wouldn't make a choice among any of those. I have a least favorite who comes from the Founders era.
So it's fine to
I can
them.
run him down. I hope there won't be any descendants of his listening. But and I don't mean to run him down, but this is one of those. The final Founders era head was a gentleman named Brooks Stabler. And this is where I get to disagreeing with the whole notion that Theodate Pope Riddle wouldn't let anybody make any changes or anything like that. He changed the name of the school.
Oh.
It was Avon Old Farms School that he took over, and he changed the name to the Avon School.
Okay.
And he changed the title of the person in charge from provost to rector. And rector, as you know, is a title with some religious overtones, and the school was certainly home to religious thoughts and observations, but it was always meant to be nonsectarian. So rector seems like an odd. And then it was he in 44. He took a job with another school and then advised the faculty that they should all leave too.
Okay.
And they did. So that makes me a little bit unhappy with him in that sense, although the history of the school would be totally different if that hadn't happened.
I was wondering, so you mentioned how some people back in the Founders era had sort of perceived Theodate Pope. I was wondering, how do you perceive Theodate Pope? I know she's definitely had a very interesting life. She was on the Lusitania, which was actually, and she had survived that, which was quite a monumental thing to do. I was just wondering, what kind of a person do you think she was like? Having done so much research on the school?
Well, first of all, there is a wonderful, fully apocryphal story about the relationship between the Lusitania and the school, which is that when she, because as you know, she ended up in the water and was actually fished out of the water with a boat hook, assumed to be dead, and put in a row of dead bodies on the deck. And it was just that somebody recognized her and in just kind of observing, isn't this a sad thing, got the sense that she might still be alive and insisted that people try to revive her and so on. But the story that's apocryphal is that when she awoke from that experience, she was in a small red sandstone village in the Cotswolds of England, and Avon Old Farms architecture was born in that moment. I wish it were true. It's not remotely true. She was on a rescue ship when she woke up, and she had already designed buildings that looked like Avon Old Farms buildings, or at least are reminiscent of Avon Old Farms buildings, before she booked passage on the Lusitania. In terms of my view of her generally, there's no question she was eccentric.
Mm-hmm.
She was strong-willed.
Mm-hmm.
I had a doctor once who told me a story that he presented as reliable,
Mm-hmm.
that there had been some engineers over near Hillstead looking at a particular corner because they thought it was dangerous and they
Mm-hmm.
just needed to kind of cut across a little bit of her property.
Mm-hmm.
And they explained that to her, and she turned to her lawyer and said, "Do I have to do this?"
Mm-hmm.
And her lawyer said, "No, you don't have to." And she just looked at the engineers and said, "No," and walked away. And I have no reason to doubt that story. I think
Uh-huh.
she could be rough.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that the stories of her, massive and wild eccentricities, or the she was too meddlesome and intrusive
Mm-hmm.
type stories, I'm not buying all of them. I know that she and her husband John Wallace Riddle went traveling in Europe
Mm-hmm.
and Asia for almost the whole first year that the school was in
Mm-hmm.
operation, expressly to get out of the way
Mm-hmm.
of the head of school and let him
Yeah.
run the place. When she got back and found out how much money he'd spent, she did start interfering a little bit. So there's a little bit from that's true
Mm-hmm.
in what's said about her, but I think there's a lot that comes down to the fact that she was a woman in the 1920s and 30s,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know, she was supposed to build the place and fund the place, but otherwise sit in a corner and say nothing, and that's
Mm-hmm.
just not who she was.
Mm-hmm. So I know that for the time at least, she had some very progressive ideas about education and what she envisioned her school would be like. I was wondering, um, I guess, how did she try to realize these hopes while also trying to, I guess, not be overly involved within the affairs of the school as it was being founded?
Well, she left a lot of notes about the way she thought schools should be conducted.
Mm-hmm.
And so, for example, on the progressive end of things, she thought that history students
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't all just read from the same history textbook, but
Mm-hmm.
every student should get a topic and go and or the class is given a topic, every student goes and does research on
Mm-hmm.
that topic and comes back with what he's been able to find out, and then in class you kind of discuss it and
Mm-hmm.
work up an understanding of the event from the collective.
Mm-hmm.
So that's different,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't think that she insisted that that happen.
Yeah.
She
Okay.
did hire, the first head of school, Francis Frolicker, was head of the Progressive Education Association. And there were a number of other people associated with the Progressive Education
Mm-hmm.
Association who were on the faculty, both the one that he led and the
Mm-hmm.
second faculty that came in after they all left in 1930. There was still Progressive Education Association people around. So I think that was more the way that she went about it, just to
I see.
establish a tone and then let it go from there.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about the founding family. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the Custer family. So I know the Custer family has been with the school for 3 generations now, 4 generations now. How did that happen?
Well, again, maybe it was a good thing the faculty resigned en masse in 1930
Uh-huh.
because my grandfather was a history teacher at Lawrenceville School
Mm-hmm.
in New Jersey, and for whatever reason chose to move to Avon Old Farms
Mm-hmm.
as the chairman of the history department. But I say chairman of the department.
Mm-hmm.
There isn't anybody else listed in the first few years as a teacher of history,
Uh-huh.
and so he was the department at least for a while, and he stayed until the school closed in 44.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, his two sons, Tom, class of 36, and my father, Ed, class of 43, were raised on campus and went to the school. So that's 2 generations when the school closed.
Mm-hmm.
And then you fast forward to 1982,
Mm-hmm.
and I was looking for a private school history teaching position.
Mm-hmm.
And having been raised and educated at a Connecticut prep school really didn't want to go to a Connecticut prep school to teach. But the one exception I made to that rule was Avon Old Farms because I knew Grandpa had taught there and Dad had been an alumnus. But that's about all I knew about the school. So I wrote to George Troutman saying I was interested in a job, and then included a short paragraph about that connection. And when I came to campus for my interview, my letter was on the counter, and I saw that he'd highlighted the college I went to, the area I would like to teach, the sports I thought I could coach, and then the whole paragraph about Grandpa and Dad he'd highlighted. So clearly, that's probably why I got the interview. I don't know if it's why I got the job, but it's close. And then my wife and I have been at Avon now for over 40 years. We have 3 sons. They're all graduates. So they were the 4th generation of Custers to be associated with the school when they enrolled. And 2 of our 3 sons and 1 of my brother's sons have also been on the faculty during the last 20 or 25 years. So
what do you think it was that kept you guys coming back to the school? Was I feel like it couldn't have just been the fact that it was like there and it's just like a coincidence. I feel like there must have been some factor about the school that you guys were really drawn to.
I think the answer is in the people. I have stayed there, and my wife has stayed with me, bless her heart, for all this time because of the other people who are there, both the students and the other faculty, particularly in the early years, but it's really still true. The faculty at Avon Old Farms makes going above and beyond simply a day-to-day routine. And when you work that hard for that long, you develop a rapport and an appreciation of the people who are alongside you doing the same thing. And we have great students. I love our students. And so I never really seriously thought about going anywhere else. And our 2 sons who ended up working there, part of that is they grew up there, they're graduates, so they were more clued in to openings. Actually, both of them were openly recruited by the school
I see.
for the roles that they did. And then my nephew, who briefly taught English at Avon Old Farms, I was at an event with my brother, and he asked how things were going. And at the time, I was dean of faculty. I said, well, when I get home, I have to try to find an English teacher. And I don't think I'd finished pronouncing the word teacher, and his cell phone was up to his ear, and he was instructing his son to contact Avon Old Farms. I didn't realize his son was looking for a job. But by the time I got back to school a week later, we'd already hired him. So I didn't have anything to do with the hiring of my nephew. It's not nepotism. I didn't hire either of my sons either. Other people did that.
And then, so this is straying a little from the topic of Avon Old Farms, but why did you personally decide to do history? What was it about the subject that drew you to it, really?
Well, there are 2 answers to that question. One is, if you have a name like Custer, you're probably going to either love it or hate it. I took a lot of grief as an elementary school kid about Custer and Custer's Last Stand, which ironically drew me powerfully to the Civil War era because Custer was really quite successful during the Civil War. So I would much rather read about the Civil War Custer than the Western Plains Indians battle Custer for lots of reasons. The other thing that drew me was the teachers I had. I was very fortunate with the teachers I had in going back really to the equivalent of middle school in 7th and 8th grade social studies, and then in 9th, 10th, and 12th grade at the independent school I went to, I had just exceptional history teachers. And so they made me want to do more.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't really related to Avon Old Farms, but just on like a side note, I feel like it's really underappreciated how much teachers actually have an impact on where their students find their interests. Because for me, so I went to Loomis, and going into Loomis, I was almost certain that I was going to do something STEM related. And then I had my first world history class, and I basically did a full 180 and just set my sights on history and like the humanities. So I totally get the impact of history and teachers on developing this sort of passion. You mentioned how last name Custer sort of drew you to studying the Custer from the Civil War. I was wondering, did this have a impact in you getting into sort of historical reenactment and that entire field?
It did, but really, my wife gets the most credit for that.
Oh, I see.
I wanted, or I thought about Civil War reenacting for most of my
Mm-hmm.
adult life. I thought that looks like a lot of fun,
Uh-huh.
but I thought it would be like golf,
Mm-hmm.
a hobby that would cost an awful lot of money and take
Mm-hmm.
me away from my family for hours and hours and hours. Little did I know it's actually days and days, not hours and hours. And so I just
Mm-hmm.
didn't pursue reenacting other than talking to somebody about it briefly at a reenactment.
Mm-hmm.
And then when our youngest son was about 10, she said to me, my wife,
Mm-hmm.
I think you and he should become Civil War reenactors. I think he would get a kick out of that.
Uh-huh.
And he did, frankly.
Uh-huh.
He and I did it together for, I don't know, almost 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then he got to be too busy with life, as one
Mm-hmm.
does.
Mm-hmm.
And so he doesn't do it anymore, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm still part of the company.
And how would you say that is? What do you enjoy about it?
Kind of the same thing. In a lot of ways, it's the other people who do it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the camaraderie around the campfire
Mm-hmm.
once the day's over. But it's also the sense of, here's an opportunity to kind of be there,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a safe way to be there. We don't fire live ammunition at each
Mm-hmm.
other.
Yeah.
We don't even voluntarily get dysentery or
Uh-huh.
lice or something
Uh-huh.
like that to fully
Mm-hmm.
experience what the boys did. But for example, one of the first big battles I did was a reenactment of First Bull Run, and
Mm-hmm.
I decided to take a hit early. So I was lying dead on the field,
Uh-huh.
and after a while, a horse-drawn cannon with
Mm-hmm.
case on went rumbling past, not so close as to put me in any danger,
Uh-huh.
but really close.
Uh-huh.
And that was just exhilarating. And then pretty soon, here's Stonewall Jackson riding his horse. Again, not so close as to
Uh-huh.
scare me, but I could see the bandage on his hand
Mm-hmm.
because he'd already been shot clearly and all that stuff. And it just was so cool
Mm-hmm.
to think, yeah, this is not a view of historical events that is easily come by.
Yeah. And I imagine part of the people is that there aren't very many people, I feel like, where you can make really niche Civil War jokes or references next to where everybody would understand and find them funny.
Right. Reenacting is very much that way. The other place where I have encountered that is at the AP U.S. History reading. I go to that every year, and our recent chief reader has a wonderful sense of humor, but it's very much a historian's sense of humor. So
Yeah.
she will say something over a microphone, and 1,000 readers in a convention center will laugh. If you could broadcast that same speech to the rest of the city,
Yeah.
no one else would laugh. It'd still be the same 1,000 people who are history teachers.
Yeah. So we went over a lot of Avon's history and then your family's relation to Avon's history. I was wondering, how has the school changed while you were with the school? Not only while you were like teaching there, but also while you grew up there, or while you're. I'm assuming actually while your kids were there, you were teaching there, but during this entire period.
It's changed. It's funny. It has changed in any number of ways, and in some ways it has not changed. In particular, I think of the third of the post-war heads of school, Ken LaRock, as the master of change without change. When Mr. Troutman was about to retire, that happened to coincide with an accreditation visit from a visiting committee representing the New England Association of Schools and Colleges. They come by every 10 years, and it was perfect because George was about to step down and Ken was going to take over. So they reported what they thought about the school, and they met with George as they do to say, here's what we think of your school. But they also met with Ken to say, here's what you need to do. And basically it was, okay, you can keep doing things the way George has done them as long as he's the head. But as soon as he's gone, you need to update stuff. And Ken did that, beginning with strategic planning and lots and lots of buildings. He really transformed the campus, but it would be wrong to think of Ken LaRocque as a building headmaster only. But the other changes he made were all done subtly or in a nuanced fashion, so that I'm sure even today, if George Troutman were able to return, he would recognize his school. And so would Don Pierpont. It's changed maybe more from Don Pierpont's day. Some of it is just what's possible. Don Pierpont used to lend his car keys to students.
Really?
Yeah, if you went and told him that you wanted to go see your girlfriend in West Hartford, he might lend you his car. And more than once, that ended poorly for the car. So it was a different time. They would just take students into Hartford and drop them off on a Saturday night. That was Saturday night activity. Just go into Hartford, see if you can survive. I don't know. So obviously there's a lot that's changed in the world during that time. In terms of the curriculum, it's interesting. I think Don Pierpont really wanted to run the school the way Theodate Pope Riddle had wanted it run. And there was a deed of trust that kind of dictated how it would be run for a while. And then the board actually, I don't have the years with me, but the board had to admit that it couldn't keep the school solvent, and so turned the running of the school over to a bank, which, among other things, meant the deed of trust was no longer in force. So he was able to do things like start interscholastic athletics. Mrs. Riddle had said only intramural athletics, with the exception, of course, of polio. You could play that against Andover and the Yale JV team, but nobody else could be interscholastic. It's all intramural. And so Pierpont started intramural athletics. But really, he was just trying to keep the school alive and doing everything he could to keep the school alive. And George Troutman was kind of the same way. But Ken LaRocque and after him, Jim DeTora, have had a real vision for the academic program and the way they wanted it to go that very much coincides with Theodate Pope Riddle's progressive views on education. So I think we're probably closer to what she was after now than we've been at any time since the World War II.
So you would say that, I'm assuming, throughout all these periods of change, introducing athletics, education, or like making innovations to the education, and I'm assuming also making additions to like things like the arts, that AOF has stayed pretty true to its initial mission that Theodate Pope had set out for the school.
I think so. I think it's very true. She had a particular focus on character education, and that has been for some time and very much is now a crucial component of what we do. We've made it that isn't really different from earlier in my career. What's different is that we've made it more kind of programmatic. We've been doing it all along in hallways and in corners and in the dorm and on the fields and so on. Now we continue to do that, but we also have specific times in the day and places where people go and we talk about character and so on.
I was wondering, what is it, so after somebody's gone through this journey at AOF for 4 years, what do you think the typical like alumni connection to the school is like? What is that community like? Do you feel like there's a strong sense of community within with AOF even after people have graduated from the school, almost as strong as while they're still on campus?
I do. To be honest,
Mm-hmm.
my perspective is one who lives on the campus. And so
Yeah.
the alumni that I encounter are the ones who come back for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
But I notice I teach in a room called the Clark Room, and it's
Mm-hmm.
dedicated to Sid Clark, who was a beloved English teacher who taught at
Mm-hmm.
Avon for 30 plus years. And that room is on the tour.
Mm-hmm.
So the admissions team will bring families through my classroom, even if I'm teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And the alumni who come through, I make a point if I realize that they're alumni or they're introduced as alumni,
Mm-hmm.
uh, pointing out Mr. Clark's portrait and
Mm-hmm.
saying, do you remember that guy?
Mm-hmm.
And the things that they say about him,
Mm-hmm.
and some of them that they say about me, because at this point, if you're an Avon graduate and you have a school-age son, then I
Mm-hmm.
was here when you were here,
Mm-hmm.
make me know that they feel pretty connected. But they've chosen to have their son look at the school.
Mm-hmm.
It could be that there are graduates touring somewhere else
Mm-hmm.
because they didn't have a great experience. I hope not, but
Mm-hmm.
I get a strong sense of community from our graduates, and I know that at this point, Jim DeTora
Mm-hmm.
travels around the country and indeed the world talking to alumni,
Mm-hmm.
and they all feel very strongly about the school and want to know what's going on
Mm-hmm.
and have advice for him
Yeah.
about what should be kept and what should not be kept and
Uh-huh.
so on. So I think it's having been to a school like
Mm-hmm.
that, it's an all-encompassing experience.
Yeah.
And so there's
Yeah.
a lot to remember and think about.
Yeah, I mean, people talk a lot about how like college is one of the most transformative experiences of your life, but I think going to one of these boarding schools is also pretty high up there on being one of the most transformative periods. And I feel like coming with that, I mean, even if there are people who didn't really enjoy that period, at least it's something that they'll probably remember probably for their entire lives. Something that sticks with them very deeply.
I agree. I think we've actually had parents who've said to me that these are not wealthy people,
Mm-hmm.
that they'd made the decision to spend their money in secondary school and that their son would not, necessarily be applying to the
Mm-hmm.
most wealthy or the most expensive
Mm-hmm.
colleges and universities because they will have spent all their money on Avon, and now
Mm-hmm.
they'll be looking for a lot of financial aid or a less expensive alternative.
Mm-hmm.
And we used to have a chairman of the board who spoke to the student body at the first Vespers every year, and
Mm-hmm.
one of the things he said was, "This is the last institution
Mm-hmm.
you'll ever be a part of that really cares about you."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes through at these schools,
Mhm.
and you can feel it even.
Yeah,
When
definitely.
other things aren't going well, wait a minute,
Mhm.
these people are on my side and
Mhm.
want the best for me, which means the best from me, and
Mhm.
so on. And people remember that, or it occurs to them later in life,
Mhm.
maybe. But that does keep the bond strong.
Yeah, I mean, we're not hired by like the admissions team of any of these schools, but the difference, and as someone who's as someone who's just started college, the difference between the connection you develop with teachers and faculty at schools like Avon Old Farms and these other boarding schools, it's so much more different. It's so much closer and more personal than the bonds that you'll develop in college. I mean, for one, these class sizes are like 10 to 12, whereas in colleges you're sitting in like a 50-room lecture or
Right.
50 people
Right.
lecture. Yeah.
I have in my office, because I'm the school historian, there
Mhm.
are 4 large prints of photographs taken during the Founders era, and one of them is of my grandfather
Mhm.
sitting at the fireplace in his house talking to 5 or 6 students.
Mhm.
So that we do that sort of thing now, but clearly in the Founders era as well, you didn't. This was not a standoffish kind of thing. Grandpa was kind of a stern guy. I got the sense from the alumni that knew him that you didn't want to cross him.
Uh-huh.
But there he was, inviting them into his house and come and
Mhm.
sit by the fire, and we'll talk about whatever it is.
Mhm.
And I think that's typical of boarding schools.
Mhm.
This podcast is an Avon Historical Society production, edited by me, Ethan Guo. Special thanks to Priscilla Marshall for the graphics. If you would like to support this podcast, please subscribe and leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever else podcasts are downloaded. Want to be featured on a future episode or stay up to date with the podcast newsletter? Feel free to reach out to us at avontalksahs@gmail.com. For more on the Avon Historical Society, visit www.avonhistoricalsociety.org.